So you're going to begin with a piece of plastic canvas, but it has hairy edges. So we're going to cut those hairy edges off with our scissors to make a nice smooth edge. So this kind of toothed or hairy edge, as I'm calling it, needs to be carefully cut away with a pair of scissors so that the edge of your plastic canvas ends on a complete square. And you'll have a nice smooth edge just like this. Do this to all sides if it's more than one side that needs to be smoothed out. Okay, then we're going to get a marker and we're going to draw our landscape. If you're doing a landscape or a cityscape, you're going to start with a horizon line. It can be straight across. It doesn't have to be straight, but mine is. It doesn't have to be in the middle. It can be kind of anywhere on your drawing. I'm now drawing some mountains. I'm going back kind of one layer into the distance with some mountains. I'm sort of following the squares in a diagonal so that I know it will be easier to stitch later if I kind of follow the squares with my drawing, whether it be diagonal or straight across or up and down. Now I'm drawing a sun in, like a sunset. And now I'm going to break up my sky into bands of shapes. So sort of like clouds, I guess, going across the sky. If you have a lot of sky space, then you should probably do something similar. Definitely break up your sky into at least 2 or 3 shapes like you see here to make it more interesting. So you can see how I've stitched it. This is the finished product. But in the foreground, I have lots of tiny little stitches that overlap each other to create texture because things closest to us have the most detail. And then in the distance, I change up my stitches to keep things interesting. So here you can see a side by side, how I handled the clouds and the stitches in the different sections. So you're going to have to start by threading your needle. You can just cut like 12 inches of thread to start and stick your thread in the eye of your needle. I like to pull the thread way down between my thumb and forefinger to keep the thread steady and then push it through. You're going to have a tiny little tail like this. And to begin sewing or stitching, we're going to come in from the back. See how I came in from the back of my work and then I pull it out through the front. So just to review, you're going to have a little tail coming out of the eye of your needle just like you see here. And you're going to have to be careful that that doesn't fall out of the eye of the needle as you stitch. So you can see I'm holding that into the eye of my needle as I pull it through my work so that it doesn't fall out, because that can be frustrating. So remember to get into the habit of doing that. And then you're going to have to hold on the back of your work just when you first start stitching, you're going to have to hold it there with your finger so that it doesn't slip out. You'll leave like 2 or 3 inches on the back of your work.
So obviously, the holes in most plastic canvas are just way too big for you to be able to tie a knot in your yarn to start stitching. So here's how you start a strand of yarn. Let's come up through the corner of this piece of canvas, and we're going to leave a tail of yarn at the back. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 inches is fine. And we're going to hold it right along the edge of the canvas there with the same hand that's holding the canvas for stitching, right? Now, I'm just going to start a simple little slant stitch. I'm going to stitch my row here in the direction of that leading tail of yarn. And with each stitch, as you can hopefully see, I'm catching that leading tail that I'm holding there. So that as I make my way down this road little by little, I'm covering up that initial piece of yarn and it'll be completely invisible by the time it's all covered up. Neat, huh? This applies no matter what kind of stitch you're going to do. So here I'm starting a row of, continental stitch or tent stitch, the standard little needlepoint stitch. Same thing, I'm going to leave a little tail at the back and hold it there at the edge. I'm going to stitch in the direction of that tail of leading yarn, and in this case, my little stitches are covering it up. You have to be a little more careful with small stitches to make sure that you're catching that leading yarn in them, but It works exactly the same way. And here we're going to stitch actually all the way to the end of that leading tail so you can see how completely it disappears.
So we're going to thread our needle and pull it up through this bottom left square. We're not going to go over the outside edge here. We're going to leave the edging alone. You're going to pull up about 1/2 inch and lay it in the back. Okay, it's just going to lay across, and we're going to trap that in as we go. So we're going to work from this bottom left to the top right. We're just going over 1. So we're going up 1 and over 1. So it's diagonal. Pull all the way down, making sure not to pull too tight and lose this strand here. And then we're going to make sure that our yarn goes around that tail. And then we're going to come up through the next square right here. So we're going to go right in here and come up, pulling through it all. Make sure not to pull too tight. And you should have this first stitch trapped in. Okay, we're going to do that again. So we're going from this bottom to the top, and we're already diagonal because we can see that first stitch already started. Just pull right on through, and you've got 2 stitches, and then go to the bottom left here, missing that tail. Otherwise, you'll go right through that strand, and you could risk pulling up some strands. So now we've got 2 trapped in here. Okay, let's go over again and pull through. And now you can see I've got several stitches. So I'm going to go to the end of this row. You can pause your video, and when you're ready, I'll meet you back up at the end, and we'll work our way to the left. See you soon. So this is the last stitch in my row. And now I'm going to go to the next row up, and we're going to just go 1 block up, or 1 square up. And then we're going to go down diagonally into this hole where the stitch is. Right in there. And we've kept our diagonal, and we're moving to the left. So we're going to go up through the next one. So right above this line, up to that very next square, and down. If you mess up, you can pull very tightly on that yarn and come up through that stitch through the back or the front, and then undo it. So that's one way that you can do it if you get in the wrong hole. Say you missed a hole, I like to pull it back really tightly and then try and fit my needle in through there. Just make sure you miss some of the fiber in that yarn. The only thing is you don't want to pull it way too tight because it can make it to where you're exposing too much of the plastic canvas, or your canvas could curl and be way too tight.
So what happens when your yarn starts to get a little short? Well, then you're going to have to tie it off and start a new strand. I usually like to do that when I have just 3 to 4 inches left on my strand. It's way easier to end thread when you have a little bit of leeway. So what I'll do is here on the back of the canvas, I'll just pass the needle underneath several stitches and pull the yarn through that, and then cut it off close to the work. Same thing applies if I'm doing tiny stitches like this continental stitch. Here on the back of the work, you can see that with tiny stitches that go backward and forward in rows, sometimes you end up with really small stitches at the back of the canvas. It's actually really hard to get a needle through those, but next to it is a row of slightly larger stitches which you can wiggle a needle through pretty easily. Or if you happen to have a row of larger stitches that's right next to where you've just been stitching, you can even take advantage of those. Pass your needle under there. Either option is perfect.
So you can use the continental stitch, but you don't have to use that. That will take you a very long time. You can see at the very, very bottom of my landscape, I used some continental stitch. But the majority of my landscape is made by random stitches, long vertical stitches that skip a lot of squares, some diagonals that all kind of go toward a single central point, like you can see on the sun. I have some diagonal stitches that sort of create a directional line in the sky to go across the sky. So you can experiment with a variety of different stitches, overlap your stitches, and just see what kind of texture they create. You have this beautiful grid that you can use in a really logical way to create cool patterns in different sections of your landscape. But I do definitely recommend that you use the most texture in the foreground, in the area that's closest to you. And as you go back in space, you change the type of stitches that you're using to differentiate each section of your landscape from another section.